Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I guess you're the founder, in some sense, of the Kaha Badukidze Center here, and I am delighted to be here. I was a huge fan of Kaha Badukidze, a man of enormous courage and insight and energy, who, as you know, in this whole region of the world has had a tremendous impact on the issues that we're going to talk about here today. And I'm dreadfully sorry that Kaha Badukidze had to die so young and so full of promise for the future. So I think it's entirely fitting that there should be a center in his name trying to pursue the ideas of freedom in your country. I never know, when I go to a place I've never been before, what sort of things I should talk about to get people enervated and excited about these ideas. So what I thought I would do is to try something out, and if it doesn't work, you tell me, and then we'll change and try to do something different. Our motto at the Fraser Institute is, if it matters, measure it. And so we right from the very beginning of the Institute, took the view that if you want to change things, you first of all have to get people to understand about them in a tangible, measurable way. That philosophical discussions of the kind that a lot of our colleagues were engaged in at the time we started the Fraser Institute, we felt were not being effective, and that you had to get to the nuts and bolts and measure things in order to show how bad things were and how good they could be. And so we constantly do measurement. And as a matter of fact, the reason why we can have the economic freedom of the world index today is because of exactly that kind of problem that emerged in 1984. I was giving a response to a paper by Paul Johnson, who was the editor of the New Statesman in Britain, on the anniversary, or in the year that the famous book 1984, George Orwell's book about a very bleak future, was supposed to have happened. And the question was, well, was George Orwell right, or was George Orwell smoking some funny kind of tea? And so Paul Johnson took the view in his paper that no, Orwell definitely was on the tea, and there was no reason to believe that the world had, in fact, developed in the way that he suggested. And I took the view looking, and he was looking from the point of view of a person interested in politics and about the political systems and so on. I looked at it from the point of view of an economist, and I said, well, was there something in what Orwell was telling us? And I'll remind you, and maybe most people don't know this, but before he wrote 1984, Paul Johnson had just read a book by Friedrich Hayek. Now, can you imagine which book that might have been? The Road to Serfdom. And so he was motivated by Hayek's vision that after the Second World War there were going to be problems, and that the state was going to become a much more significant factor in people's lives. And so Orwell read the Road to Serfdom and then wrote his book. So I was thinking, well, maybe Orwell had something different in mind. And so when I was responding to Paul Johnson's paper, I said, I think that Orwell was exactly correct. Now in Canada, I was talking about Canada and some of my experience there. In Canada, every time I made a political donation, or every time I made a donation to somebody else, and when I made transactions, I had to report my Social Security number or the number of my business. And the state was monitoring all of my transactions. So I took the view that while we didn't have the horrific then image, at least, of cameras in our rooms monitoring us. I guess now our TVs are doing that, I'm told. So maybe he was right also in that sense. But the I took the view that you know, there was a lot of evidence to suggest that our economic freedoms were being damaged, being controlled. And so then a big debate emerged in the society, the Montpellier Society, which is the group that hosted the event, which Friedrich Hayek also had created in 1949. In any event, there was a debate about what was important, economic freedom or political freedom. And could you have political freedom if you didn't have economic freedom? And Milton and Rose Friedman were there and with me and at the same meeting. And Rose, after I came down from making my remarks, said, you know, I think you're actually absolutely right. And Milton, of course, had to take the different point of view at that moment. But it became clear when we were having our discussions that we could not resolve the question of what was important, economic or political freedom, because we had no measurements, good measurements of either. There were some measurements of political freedoms conducted by Freedom House out of New York, but we did not have good measurements of economic freedom to have a debate. And so I said to Milton and Rose, well, why don't we just start looking into this? And if I can raise some money, how about if we have some symposiums and conferences and see if we can't come up with some way of measuring economic freedom? And that's where the project started. And as you can see, it didn't come out of some airy-fairy measurement issue. It came out of a very important issue, and that is, what is happening to our economic freedom? Is that important? And what has happened to our political freedom? And now in Europe, as you know, there are issues of both kinds that are coming to the fore. But anyway, so that project, which we started in 1984, is now led very ably by a team made up of James Gwartney, Robert Lawson, Joshua Hall, and Fred McMahon. And they are here at this conference, and or at another conference in town. And if you get an opportunity to talk to them, I would greatly encourage you to do that. Now I've got to use this thing to. There we go. So there are the names of the people who are involved. So, and by the way, the secret sauce of our project has been international collaboration. We have been able to collaborate with different institutions around the world, and I'm particularly pleased today to mention the fact that Ian Vasquez is here from the Cato Institute. They've been big supporters of our work, and also Detmar During and Andrei Larionov, who have been recently now. Detmar is not here, but Andrei Larionov will be here. I don't know if everybody's coming to all of these conferences, but we're having 2 days of conferences, and they will be here in the city for more discussions. What I want to talk to you about today, and I can talk about this because we started that project back in 1984, is how are we doing in the world? What is the level of economic freedom in the world? How has it been progressing? Are we winning? Are we winning the war of getting better economic policies around the world? And now I'm changing them. I've got to change both things here so I'll know where I am. Okay. Are we succeeding? Well, the question that first must be discussed is, well, how do we measure freedom? When we started this off, many people said, you can't measure freedom. Freedom is something, it's in the air, it's intangible. You can't measure freedom. But it took us quite a while, and finally it was actually Bob Lawson and James Gwartney who crystallized the thinking that had gone on for quite a number of years. And what we realized is, while we can't measure directly freedom, we can measure the efforts that governments undertake to suppress freedom. So we measure the amount of resources that governments are using to stop people from having freedom, and then rank the countries according to the extent to which the governments are trying to suppress freedom, and that's what we use in our index. We also use some surveys of people who think they know what the level of freedom is in countries, and get their expressions of view. But it's basically measuring the amount of effort that governments use against the level of freedom. And that is in 5 different areas. The first one is the size of government. And it's quite clear why you would want to measure the size of government, right? Because if the government is using 80%, let's say, of the spending power in an economy, how much freedom can there be for individuals? So we want to measure the size of government. The second area is the rule of law and property rights. If the government or somebody else can simply take your property at their whim, then you don't have freedom. You don't have the control over the most basic part of your life, which is your property, control over your property. So we need to measure the rule of law and property rights. And the third thing we want to measure is, is whether we have sound money. Because if the government, as it has done in many instances in the past, simply printed money so that they in effect steal your property by inflation, then that also is a limitation on your freedom. And so the fourth area is freedom to trade with foreigners. If you can't trade with foreigners, if you can only trade within your own community, then that's a limitation on your freedom. And then finally, there's your freedom to trade in labor markets, in markets for capital and general business. Now we measure the world. We look at every country that has data, and it's currently about 159 countries. And I say about because we have some limited measurements on some of those countries. But we have a lot. We are looking at all of the countries for which there are data. And we score them in each of the areas that we look at. We score the behavior on a 0 to 10 scale. So, for example, how would we do that? Let's consider, say, the tax rates in a country. So what we do is we take all the tax rates from around the world, from all the countries, and we put them in a list. We say, okay, here is the lowest tax rate, here is the highest tax rate, and then we rank all the countries on that so-called mini-max scale between 0 and 10. So, and we do the same thing for the other things that we measure. So we end up with, at the end of all of the calculations, we find a country ranks, gets a rating of, I got to be careful between rating and ranking, gets a rating of, say, 7.5. And 7.5 is an average of all of the different 42 indicators that we use to measure the level of freedom. Now, while we would, if we're looking at those scores, and because I'm going to show you now a whole bunch of measurements. I'm going to show you the whole world in each of the areas that we measure on one slide. And we're going to look at how that has evolved over time. But it's important that you understand what we're looking at. So what we're looking at is we're trying to figure out if, as we've moved through time in the various things that we measure, has there been an improvement? Has the world gone, maybe if we started off as a 0, getting 0, or close to 0, have we been moving from a 0 to a 2 to a 4 to a 5 and up to a 10 in the different areas that we measure? So when I show you the slides, we're looking for movement toward 10, but we're also looking at a whole bunch of different countries. So we're not just interested in the average score, we're interested in, if you think about grading students, you're not just interested in the average score, you're interested in, is there a whole bunch of dunces down at the bottom and a whole bunch of really smart people up at the top? Or is everybody sort of around the middle? Is everybody around that number that you've got, the average? And so we're going to look at this data both from the point of view of whether we've been improving in the average score and in the variance around the average score. So I'm going to show you a slide here, some slides here now to show you what kind of evolution might we see in the numbers once we get there. So if we're looking at a particular area and we're getting a policy score out of 10, and we're looking at a series of countries from 2007 to 2005, for example, from 1970 rather to 2005. So this is the first one. So this shows you the data for 1970, and it's showing you that there were very few countries who got actually down toward the zero end. And then, see, this is, I should point out, this is the frequency for each of these data. So if I pick this one here that's right on the line, this says that 5% of the countries, 5% of the countries scored at this level here. 10% scored at that level there. 10% scored also up here. About 10% scored up here. So you're getting, what we're going to be, we're showing you the frequency of different scores amongst the countries. And now, this is another year, and you can see that the shape of this distribution is changing as we move through time. And this is the kind of pattern we'd like to see. We'd like to see more and more countries, because this is, when we get a point like this that says, look, oh, we've got now more than 20% are scoring at that level there and above. So we would like to see that point moving farther and farther up here so that eventually it would just move right up against this edge of the distribution here. So that's what we're looking for. So now let's go and see what the world actually looks like. And the first thing we're looking at is the size of government. And I call it global agreement about the size of government because don't forget what we're looking at here is the actual outcome of the choices of more than 100 countries. And the people in those countries choosing how much government they want. How much government is revealed? Well, it may not be how much they want. How much are they getting? Which may be different. How much government are they getting in terms of the size of government? So this is the actual number for, set of numbers for 1970. And you can see it was all over the place, just like our fake chart. Now you can see 1975. Still very much over the place, but now we're definitely getting a kind of a peak, and there's more people scoring up toward this 5 area, and maybe less scoring in the over 5 area. So we don't know that that's necessarily good, but there's kind of a pattern emerging, and now we see by 1995 the most likely number, which is, oops, this is, oh my gosh, what's happened here? This is all gibbled here. I don't know what's happened there, but that's probably 16% or something. And you can see that we're making some progress in the sense that by the time we get to 2013, which is the last year I measured, all of these countries that were down here have been eliminated. Not eliminated, they've moved up. They've improved their performance. And so more and more of the countries are scoring higher and higher on our 0 to 10 scale in the size of government, and fewer are getting really miserable scores down in the very lowest end. Another way of looking at this, if you're more statistical rather than pictorial in the way you think of things, is that gradually the mean score has been increasing, and the mean score is measured over here. So we started around 6, and then we had a decline in our scores for a while, and the average score, and then gradually moved up so that we've made some improvement by 2013 in the average score. But more importantly than that, well, not more importantly, but as important is the fact that we have a decline in the amount of variability amongst countries. In other words, there's an increasing amount of, not only are we improving our score in the size of government, but there's more agreement amongst countries that we should be moving in that direction. We're getting more agreement amongst countries in that direction. Now, the second one is global agreement about property rights and the rule of law. And once again, this one, when we started off in 1970, was literally all over the map. You can see almost anything goes in regard to the rule of law. And what is the pattern that's emerging here? Whoops. We're not really doing all that well in terms of the rule of law, because there really hasn't been there really has not been, ladies and gentlemen, much improvement in the rule of law. By the time we get to 2013, we have, it is true, eliminated all these countries back here who were scoring 3.5 and 2.5 and so on. But the average score is still only, or the modal score, the most likely score is still only 5.5 out of 10. And if we look at that in terms of our mean, you can see that we've made really, compared to the first year we measured, the average has actually been below it ever since. And you might say, well, why was that? The reason is that when we first measured the property rights, we had only 75 countries. And those 75 countries were all advanced industrial countries for the most part. And then as we added to the database and we got more of the countries who had been out of, as it were, the modern economy, we in fact had a worsening in the average score, and we still got some reduction in the amount of variation in the data. And there was more agreement emerged, but unfortunately the agreement that emerged was around very, very poor results. Now, this chart, I'm pleased to show you this chart because, I'm happy to tell you that before Milton Friedman died, I was able to show him early versions of this chart, and this is really the vindication of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, as you know, his principal interest, particularly for the latter part of his career, was in monetary policy and the control of inflation. Well, his ideas are reflected big time in this chart because you can see right away it's a very different pattern. There's much more activity in this side of the 5.5, very little activity back here, and by the time we come to the last part of the chart, we see a huge amount of adoption, a huge number of countries scoring over 7, And in effect, this is the triumph of an idea that the control over the money supply is a very important part of creating a secure set of rights for everybody. Because if the government uses the money supply to finance its expenditures, as is going on in Zimbabwe and many of the countries, unfortunately still many of the countries in the underdeveloped parts of the world, then you can't have any kind of security of your property, particularly if the government won't allow you to hold a foreign currency bank account, which is what enables you to get away from the government's grasp. So here you can see the big increase in the mean score, notwithstanding the fact that we had this drop-off, but we more than made up for that by the time we ended the measurement period. And from a very a very high level of agreement in the first part of the period, we got back to that level by the end with also an increased level of the mean. Now, this is another one of the areas where economists, there are areas where economists agree and some areas where they disagree. And so if you read some of the, let's call them the new economists who don't agree with other economists about how well markets function and this kind of thing, even amongst those people, there is virtually no disagreement amongst economists about the benefits of free trade, of being able to trade with your neighbor without any impediment. And so this is, in many ways, one of the most important of the freedoms, economic freedoms that people have or don't have. And as you can see, while economists may have agreed, there was a wide variation amongst the countries that we measured through much of the period. And then towards the end of the 1990s and coming into 2000, there seemed to be a lot more agreement emerging in the countries of the world about the importance of free trade. And as you can see, it gets one of the highest frequencies of the ones that we've looked at, other than for the money supply. And you can see that we've eliminated most of the countries below the 5.5 level, and we have a mode now, or a mode for this distribution, which is almost 8. So we're really doing well in trade. And so when you're looking at a country, because we're going to look at your country in a few moments, when you're looking at a country, this is one of the areas where if you're not doing well, you really are out of the game, and you're violating one of the very most important aspects of economic freedom. Once again, it shows up in the reduction in variance and the big increase in the mean value calculated from the data. Now we have global interference in business markets in business markets and for labor and credit. And once again, we have, right off the bat, we had some high level of agreement and an improvement over time in which, so once again, this is, if you're studying economics now, if you're studying economics, when you look at these data, you have to feel very good, because it's the result of economists making arguments in favor of the freedom of business to operate in capital markets and in the markets for labor that produces these kinds of outcomes. And if you think about it, if you think of your career task as an economist, one of them is to get more and more people thinking that they should be having more freedom in labor markets and in capital markets and in the markets for general business. So here's once again, the mean and the variance for, so an significant increase in the mean and reduction in the variance of what people think is a good policy. Now we come to the overall, this is the measurement. We're putting all 5 areas together now, and we're seeing what has happened to the global level of economic freedom over the period since 1970. Well, when we started, not so good. And for some of the period, see, I would say that was a retrograde step. And when was that? 1975. That was when the British government, for example, was being run by the trade union movement, and it was setting the scene for Mrs. Thatcher to make her entry, because they were nationalizing all the businesses, they were shutting down all the markets and so on in Britain. And so there was a bad period during which economic freedom in the world was not doing all that well. There was almost a sort of an agreement emerging here that was not so great. But as we move forward, the same sort of pattern is emerging, that the global level of economic freedom, because of what we have observed in the components, the global level of economic freedom has improved quite dramatically. And all of that, this mischievous behavior back here by governments has been eliminated, and we are now getting more and more of the government, or more and more of the countries scoring above the average, not above the average, but above a five, the middle of the scale. And now we're going to look at just 1 year and look at these are the different, and why am I doing this? These are the 5, this is looking at the whole world and looking at the 5 areas and superimposing them on each other. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I was asked to talk to you about where are we winning and where are we losing. And I would say that, you know, we're certainly winning in the regulation area. We're certainly winning in the area of trade. We're blown the doors off with regard to control of the money supply. But we are not doing very well in the size of government. And in this very important one here, which is the rule of law. The rule of law, which we think is the most important area, and I'm going to show you some data on that in your countries, provided I have the time. How much time do I have left? Finish up now. Oh, I'm finished, 3 minutes. Oh, well, I won't be showing you that. But I do have some data. Well, maybe I should just skip to that and show you what Ukraine looks like. Well, I'm going to show you this chart. It's very important that you get a sense of how great has been the impact around the world of this movement towards higher levels of economic freedom. And what I'm showing you here is 2 measurements. One is just looking at the average level of economic freedom that comes out of our measurements of the 150 countries. And that doesn't look like we've had much of an improvement since the 70s. But when you look at this chart here, which takes the countries and weights them by their population. So, to make the point more clear, in this line here, China gets the same weight as Madagascar. That doesn't seem very sensible, does it? So, in the dark blue line, we're looking at the level of economic freedom weighted by the population. And as you can see, the average level of economic freedom for the citizens of the world, which is what we're talking about, was about 3 in 1975 and is nearly 7 today. So that what we have had is a doubling for the average citizen. And in this country and in this part of the world, you're particularly and acutely aware of that, because during that early part of the period, you did not have very much economic freedom like much of the rest of the world. Now, I was going to now look at some winners and losers. I'm going to show you this one, because it's kind of one that's out of it's not from here. And so we can look at it dispassionately. I was going to show you comparisons of Ukraine and Hungary and a few other things, but Fred McMahon is also going to talk about that, so I'm going to leave that. But I do want to share you with this example from North America. Because in North America, we have, of course, got the United States, the sort of behemoth, it's the gorilla of economics, right? And then there are two what we should refer to as the elephant of economics. And then there are two mice who live on each side of it. There's the Canadian mice and the Mexican mice. And we are much smaller in size and population and everything else in the United States. But we do share, Mexico and Canada share a lot of things. We are both in the same trade agreement with the United States. We both share a border with the United States. We both fought a historic war with the United States. I must say the Canadians won ours, but the Mexicans, unfortunately, didn't win theirs. But, but we did. And we also have, both Canada and Mexico and Canada have extraordinary natural endowments, and we're both energy producers and exporters. So we are very, very similar. But look at the differences in our incomes. These are the incomes of Mexico. These are the incomes of Canada from 1975 forward. And I just want to show you why those numbers look like that. I can show you in one page. Here is Mexico's scoring in the 5 areas we've been talking about: size of government, property rights, sound money, foreign trade, markets for labor, capital, and business. And this is how they have evolved from 1980 to 2014. And can you see what Mexico's problem is? If you look across this last line here, you can see what Mexico's, which it's right here. And it's right here. It's because in Mexico, property rights and the rule of law do not exist, and have gotten, in some sense, worse over time rather than better. The freedom in markets for labor, capital, and business have got somewhat improved, but still a rather poor score compared to the Canadian scores. Look at our property rights and the rule of law. Look at our regulation of business, labor, and capital markets. So it's pretty simple, actually. If you want to triple your income, if you've got two countries that are pretty much the same, you need to have respect for the rule of law and property rights that are like Canada's, along with the other part of the things that are like Canada's. Now, the size of government we don't do great on. And if we had more time, I would explain to you that there's a relationship between this one and this one. I think there's going to be a hole appear underneath me, and I'm going to go down into the floor if I keep on talking. So I'm going to stop now, and then maybe is there any time for questions, or are we just going to stop? Okay, just stop. Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Well, thank you very much.